Okay, hi everyone. Welcome to our e-seminar. Today we have Lorenzo Livi, who is a professor at the University of Manitoba, and he's also a honorary senior lecturer in data science at the Department of Computer Science at the University of Exeter. His research is interested in the area of machine learning, time series analysis, and complex dynamical systems. And he has a particular focus on application in system biology and computational neuroscience. And today he will tell us about training and dynamics of recurrent neural networks, which is a really exciting topic. So I'm glad to have you here and to hear your talk. Yeah.
Thank you. All right. So thank you very much for this introduction, and thank you very much for having me here. So, today's talk is going to be about recurrent neural networks. And in particular, I'm going to overview training aspects and dynamical problems in terms of dynamical systems related to the recurrent neural networks. So can you hear me loud and clear?
Yes.
Yeah, very good.
Perfect.
All right. So the works that I'm going to present have been done with the people that you see here that are my collaborators for this kind of research. And the first one, Andrea, was my first PhD student, one of the first, and now he's a postdoc in Italy. And Peter Ashwin is a very cool professor of dynamical systems that I met at Exeter. And Filippo is my, actually we did PhD together, and we keep collaborating on various things, including recurrent neural networks. And Cesare Lippi is one of my collaborators from Italy and Switzerland, and we did several things together. So that's the outline of the presentation. I'm probably going to skip something to be within the hour that we have, so I'll try to remain under 1 hour, let's say 50 minutes. So I'm going to skip some technical details, but I'm going to talk about three things, basically: training aspects and interpretability of the behavior of recurrent neural networks, and what I'm calling reliability of the behavior, how to define and how to quantify or how to study the reliability of a recurrent neural network at inference time. And okay, so I will assume that you are all familiar with basic machine learning stuff, and you're also familiar with recurrent neural networks. I think this is a fair assumption, since this is a seminar on machine learning, right? So recurrent neural networks can be introduced in many different ways. I will introduce recurrent neural networks in this way. Let's say a basic architecture looks like this. And I like to think about recurrent neural networks as input-driven dynamical systems. Because in machine learning we always have inputs that define the task, and accordingly also we have outputs that are the supervision that we can exploit. The architecture that we see here is clearly one of the possible architecture, but I will say the more advanced architecture that we know are very similar to this diagram that we see here. So there are inputs, then there are recurrent connections in between here, and that's what gives the network the memory, and that's what makes the network dynamical systems, basically. And possibly we can include the feedback from the output and things like that. Clearly, there are parameters going on. The input is injected into the network with parameters. Recurrent connections have parameters. I'm skipping the biases, but and the output layer is produced in some way. It can be a complex function, or it can be simply a linear transformation depending on the task, right? So if we look at the equations, we immediately agree that recurrent neural network is a dynamical system. The interesting for the formulation that you see here is in discrete time. we can think in continuous time, and it's interesting, but for now we are happy with discrete time. I'm highlighting in blue the input, because the input plays an important role. And yes, there are dynamical systems, but the input is not just a detail, not just a perturbation, is a fundamental player in the in everything that happens in a recurrent neural network. And that's also why it's very difficult, at least for me, in my opinion, to study recurrent neural networks deeply. Right, so the input is having many effects on the network, and in particular is you can think of the effects of the input in many different ways. One way to look at the effects of input is that the update of the network becomes time dependent. So if you want to think about it in a different way, the input, the update of the network changes depending on the input, right? So that's a form of non-autonomous dynamical system, which we call input-driven dynamical systems, right? So they are dynamical systems that change over time. They depend on time. All right, so that's the key ingredient, I would say here, and that's also, as I said, what makes recurrent neural networks very difficult to analyze, at least for me. Anyway, so recurrent neural networks, even if they are difficult to analyze, they have been used a lot in application, and they are currently used a lot in many applications. You can use recurrent neural network to learn attractors, learn how to regenerate things. So basically, this is a task of learning how to generate things, so they can be used to generate sequences, images, whatever. They can be used for classifying sequences. So we learn, basically, you can think of a recurrent neural network that learns a separating surface in phase space, state space, if you want. Or clearly, you can do forecasting of tendencies, right? So they're very popular. And I think there is lots of research going on, of course, lots of hybrid models, lots of improvements, lots of different things. I think there are three challenges for now and also for the future that are still open, I would say. There is lots of research in the first one, and it's about training recurrent neural networks. So depending on the specific model we are talking about, then we have different problems related to the training, but training is still a challenge in terms of recurrent neural networks, and I will say something about this in a few minutes. And the second challenge is about the interpretability of the behavior of the network once it's trained. With this I mean, once we train the network, we use the network to make decisions, right? And we typically don't care what's going on inside the network, how the network solves a task. But I guess that's important, right? We should at some point make sense of what the network is doing, how the network is solving a task, right? If you think about important application, you want to try and understand why the network fails, for instance, right? The common practice right now is to train again and try again and see if it works. But I think it's much better if we understand why it fails, for instance, sometimes, and also why it works, how it works. These kind of questions, I think, at some point should become important, right? So we should go beyond the black box paradigm at some point. Third challenge is about reliability of the behavior. I'm not sure whether this is the right word, but with this, I mean, do we have any guarantee that the network is doing something correct? Can we come up with some theoretical guarantee that the network will behave in some way? And this is still an open question. There is a significant amount of research for specific models that we will discuss, but to my knowledge, at least, there is little or no interest from other type of networks about these kind of questions. So these are the challenges that I'm going to discuss. So let's see about something about training. So first of all, I'm going to introduce training with backpropagation. So I'm talking about recurrent neural networks that are trained with backpropagation through time. So gradient descent and backpropagation through time. Right, so this kind of networks are, we know that all recurrent neural networks are very powerful, but training with backpropagation through time is tricky because of the vanishing, that's a typo here, vanishing exploding gradient problem. No, it's not a typo. That's due to this product here of the Jacobians, which needs to be controlled. Otherwise, you know, the spectral, the spectrum of this, the resulting matrix will shrink or will explode, and the resulting gradient basically will become meaningless because will go to infinity or to zero, so it's not useful. That's the vanishing exploding problem, and there is lots of research, especially these past few years. I've seen lots of very good papers, lots of interesting papers, but let's say there are different approaches to this problem that have been taken by researchers in general, I would say. So something like 20 years ago, people started, you know, they said, oh, let's forget about backpropagation to time, let's invent another type of training, and they come up with random recurrent neural networks that are trained in a different way. I will talk a bit about this. Examples are echo state networks, for instance, where the recurrent part is not actually trained with backpropagation or things like that. Only the output layer is trained for the task, for the specific task at hand. But there are still design choices that needs to be made, and so there is some form of training going on, but backpropagation doesn't happen in random recurrent neural networks. Another family of models that tries to avoid vanishing exploding gradient problem is the one that exploits the gates. So we know that these models, let's say, mitigate the problem, but they do not solve the problem, and they mitigate the problem, but we currently do not know how they mitigate the problem and why they mitigate the problem. There is some intuition that the gates are tuning the time scale of the network somehow, and they are mitigating the effects of the vanishing exploding gradient problem, but we still don't know exactly what's going on there. And another family of methods involves basically coming up with smart parameterization of the network of standard, let's say, recurrent neural networks, so without gates. Researchers have come up with smart parameterization that basically avoid the vanishing and exploding problem. And those are interesting because they give you also proof that vanishing and exploding gradient problem is not going to happen. And they seem to be working fine for benchmarks and things like that. So this is what's going on, at least for sure. I forgot something, right? Some papers and some references, but I think these are the three main approaches that are out there. But if we move to the random recurrent neural networks, there is some research, a significant amount of research focusing on the hyperparameters of random recurrent neural networks like echo state networks. And here I've done something in the past with Filippo and Cesare. We published a few papers about how to come up with unsupervised mechanism to perform hyperparameter tuning for echo state networks. And that's a form of training of this specific type of recurrent neural network. So I'm going to allocate a few minutes here to give you some details of what we have done. And so the even if the most of the parameters of the network, like the inputs, weights, the recurrent connections, and the feedback of the output, they are randomly initialized. They are not, yes, they are randomly initialized, but there is some tuning of for instance, the spectral radius of this matrix is, because it's well known that we need to control these kind of parameters, otherwise the network won't work. So they are random, yes, they're randomly initialized, but the hyperparameters controlling, for instance, the spectral radius of the recurrent weights, it's a fundamental hyperparameter that needs to be fine-tuned for the task at hand, otherwise the network won't work. So there is a need for training here, right? Even if we are talking about one parameter, right? And it's a hyperparameter, right? There are other hyperparameters that play an important role. It's not important for our discussion. Clearly, you can consider all these hyperparameters as a set of hyperparameters that you want to optimize for the task. Now, the question is how to do it. Clearly, you can do grid search, right? But doing grid search over a significant number of hyperparameters, you need to do cross-validation, and you need to do lots of things. And it's definitely possible. It's going to take a significant amount of resources, even if training echo-state networks is faster than recurrent neural networks with pair propagation. But we would like to come up with a principled way to set the hyperparameters. And people, actually a long time ago in this field, started thinking about computation on the edge of chaos. So exploiting basically the so-called edge of chaos to set the parameters of a recurrent neural network. And basically here you see the sketch of the Lorenzo attractor operating in two different regimes. On the left-hand side, you see some parameterization of the dynamical system, which gives you an ordered behavior, a fixed point behavior. And on the, so this part here is what we call ordered dynamics. And chaos is obtained with well-known parameterization of the Lorenzo attractor, and give you the attractor that you see on the right-hand side with the two wings, typical wings of the Lorenzo attractor. So computation on the edge of chaos is something that happens right here. So we would like, the idea is to find a parameterization of a recurrent neural network in this case, because we have a parallel between a recurrent neural network and dynamical system, right? So we want to find parameterization which brings the network right in this surface separating the two behaviors between order and chaos. All right. So this is something that has been analyzed a lot, and in particular also for recurrent neural networks. There is a significant amount of research. You see paper from Susillo, Abbott, and many others. For instance, let me find the references here. You see some Polisky from a long time ago, and many other references that are clearly not here. Also important papers by Mass and Legenstein. So there is lots of research, and I would say that this research, as I said, is about defining or finding a parameterization which brings the network operating on the edge of chaos, so on this surface which separates the stable behavior from the chaotic behavior of the network. Now, here the important point is that a recurrent neural network is not an autonomous dynamical system like this one, right? So there is an input which is driving the dynamics. So even if, assuming we can come up with a definition of chaos which makes everyone happy in the case of input driving the dynamic, it's still the edge of chaos. It's still something that depends on the specific input which is forcing the network, right? So, and experimentally, the edge of chaos is determined by looking at things like the largest Lyapunov exponents of the network, or things which are very related to the Lyapunov exponent, essentially, indicators that revolve around the idea of Lyapunov exponents. And it has been noted that the edge of chaos, so the separation between ordered and chaotic behavior, changes with the strength of the input. So it's very difficult. Basically, the bottom line is that it's very difficult to come up with a theoretical definition of the edge of chaos in the presence of input. Right? There is some work in the literature, but they make a strong assumption. For instance, the original work from Sempolinsky do not consider inputs, so autonomous RNN. The rho here is the spectral radius of the recurrent weights, and that's what we expect, right? When the spectral radius is larger than 1, we observe chaos in autonomous recurrent neural networks. Then there are slightly more interesting theoretical definition of this edge of chaos that assume noise as input, which is not, I would say, not relevant in terms of machine learning. And when we consider real inputs, that's where the problems, that's where we find the problems, because there is no, to my understanding, there is no precise definition of what's the edge of chaos. There is some interesting work done by Manjunat, recently published by Manjunat and Jaeger, but it's still not very useful in practice. So if you look at the papers, they're very, very nice ideas, but it's, especially for this one, very nice theoretical ideas, but it's difficult to use in practice. So how do we find the edge of chaos? So we still need to rely on indicators that we compute on the states that we observe from the network when we process inputs. And what we have done with my collaborators, you see in this publication here, we have linked the idea of critical phase transition to basically the idea of we have used the idea of critical phase transition to come up with a way to detect the onset of critical behavior. So what we have defined before as the transition between order and chaotic behavior. We have done this by exploiting a theoretical link between the Fisher information and the critical transition. Basically, it's possible to show that a second order phase transition can be detected by looking at the Fisher information of the system we are analyzing. So here, just to make it more understandable, this diagram that you see here is you should think about this theta here, theta 1, theta 2 as the parameter of the network. And the Fisher information I'm talking about is a Fisher information matrix, right? Because we have more than one hyperparameter controlling the behavior of the network. And the Fisher information is quantifying the sensitivity of the network, by variations, infinitesimal variation of the parameters controlling the behavior. All right, and the theory of continuous phase transition is telling us that where the Fisher information is maximized, or diverges in if we are thinking about a continuous system, there we observe critical phase transition, and accordingly there is where we find the edge of criticality of or edge of chaos, depending on how you want to call it. So we proposed a methodology to estimate the Fisher information matrix specifically for echo state network, and we have used this this optimization method for finding the hyperparameters of the echo state network. So it's potentially interesting. There are tons of problems when you try to do something like this, right? And first of all, the estimation of the feature information when the number of parameters grows, it's a mess. So it's interesting. There are many problems, and let's skip the problems and let's focus on something else. So let me conclude. So hyperparameter tuning is, let's say that there is a significant amount of research, but as I said before, the exploitation of this idea of edge of chaos is tricky, because I think it's tricky, the definition of edge of chaos, when there is input that is forcing the dynamics, right? So there is a significant amount of papers. I think a significant contribution in this direction is difficult right now because of the lack of theoretical something that I think will make the mathematicians happy about, chaos in the presence of input. All right, so let me move to the other challenge. All right, and we have done something in this direction too. And now we talk about interpretability of the behavior. So we assume that the network is trained. We don't care how it's trained. We don't really care also about the specific model for the recurrent neural network. We assume it's trained. We use the network for solving a task. Now, as I said before, typically people do not care about what's going on in the network, let's say, or in phase space, because we are happy with the black box behavior, right? But I insist that this is going to be a problem at some point, because, especially because of the inability to understand the problems. So when things go wrong, who should we blame? What's going on? Why the network didn't work? We don't know, basically. But a recurrent neural network is an input-driven dynamical system. So when we train the network, we have learned an input-driven dynamical system operating in phase space. That's what we learn, right? Clearly, it's a very complex dynamical system, high-dimensional, driven by an input, potentially with multiple time scales going on if we use the gates and all this kind of stuff, right? But it is a dynamical system driven by an input. So there must be some sort of attractors, some sort of basins, something, right? So when we train the network and we learn attractors, right? Some form of attractor, let's say. So we have done something, but in a very, let me put it this way, very simplified setting, where the network is receiving impulsive inputs. So basically the network is autonomous and is perturbed by inputs that occur in specific time steps. And these are just perturbations. So they can be treated as perturbations. Why we've done that? Because in this way, we were able to exploit the mathematical framework of excitable network attractors. That's something that Peter worked a lot. He worked a lot on excitable network attractors. And so that's why we collaborated. And so let me tell you a bit what are excitable network attractors and why they can be useful for, start opening the black box. So let me first say that if you look at the literature of people that try to open the black box in the way I described, there is not much around because it's very difficult, right? There are more recent publications by Susillo, but they are still they're still operating in specific settings, I would say. The most recent one is this one by Susillo and Barak, and it has been published like 10 years ago, right? So it's something difficult and perhaps not very appealing to researchers, right? So an excitable network attractor, before I tell you what it is, I tell you what can be used for. It can be used for explaining at least we have used it to explain the behavior of autonomous recurrent neural networks. And I think the most interesting, apart from the model and the methods that we have provided in this paper here, I think the most interesting part from a practical point of view is that we were able to explain errors occurring during the computation. And that's, I think, the most important aspect of our work. So what is an excitable network attractor? An excitable network attractor is basically a directed graph that you should imagine embedded in phase space or state space, right? And the directed graph is composed by nodes and directed edges. The nodes are fixed points in this model, and the edges are excitable connections. So there are thresholds which need to be that controls the transition between the fixed points of the network. So the fixed points can be stable fixed points, of course, and basically these are the states that you're modeling, right? And in particular, the excitable network attractor we have considered is only considering fixed points, stable fixed points as states that you're modeling, and the excitable connection clearly model the transitions between the states, right? Now, I know that there are models of excitable network attractors that employ more complex attractors, type of attractors like limit cycles or even chaotic attractors, but they become useless in practice. At least we were not able to come up with anything with the more complex attractors. So we exploited this basic model combining fixed point with excitable connections. So the idea is to look at the trained recurrent neural network and reverse engineer this. Reverse engineer an excitable network attractor which explains the behavior of the network while solving a task. So what the network has learned and how it solves a task. Okay. Now, as you can imagine, fixed points are simple attractors, so they cannot model very complex behavior, even if we can model the transitions between the fixed points. They are still fixed points, so not much going on, I guess. But that's the best we could do. And so we have considered different toy problems, of course, in the paper to make sure that the methodology was working, was reverse engineering, the correct excitable network attractor given the task, the control task. And then we have considered also this memory task proposed by Sussillo in other papers, because it's still a simple enough task that requires learning memory states, but it's slightly more complex than the toy problem we have considered. So how much time do I have? 20 minutes, so I'll speed up a bit. So the network, of course, any recurrent neural network can learn to switch between memory states, right? You usually imagine a variable number of inputs, like with 3 binary inputs, you can have 8 states, right? That's all the possible configuration. With 2 inputs, you have 4 states, right? Let's say 4 states are enough to model all possible states. So your network, you expect that your network, once you train the network, has 4 fixed points, right? So as you can see, the network is very good. The network we have trained is very good, but here something is going on, right? And what's going on there is explained by looking at the reverse engineered excitable network attractor from the model. And that's how it looks like. So clearly this is messy, right? But you can see that there are 6 fixed points. So the network has learned 2 additional fixed points, which shouldn't be there. And these numbers that you see here are, they represent the excitability threshold. A low value means that that threshold can be activated very easily. As you can see, you can easily transition from this state to this state. And basically that's where the errors occur, right? So we were able to understand why there are errors that you see here. And that's, I guess, one way to look at one way to insist in this direction, I guess, right? Because I think this might be very useful for more relevant applications, of course. Now, the main point is that we can reverse engineer autonomous recurrent neural networks perturbed by impulsive inputs. Not very interesting in machine learning. If you want to go beyond what we have done, we should consider, if you consider continuous time varying inputs, the dynamics of the network becomes non-autonomous, input driven in particular. So the attractors that we reverse engineer are not fixed points, they are non-autonomous attractors. So they're not limit cycles, they're not autonomous attractors. So everything becomes way more complicated, and we didn't do anything in this direction. So if you want to do something that accounts for actual input, which are relevant in machine learning, things become way more complicated because you have to account for non-autonomous dynamical systems. And I'll say something about what are non-autonomous attractors. All right, so let's talk about reliability of, or what I called reliability of the behavior in state space. So the third challenge, right? So once we have trained the network, let's say that we can, even if we can figure out how it behaves, can we come up with principles, let's call it this way, which gives us like a certificate that the network is going to behave in specific ways. Let's put it this way. So these kind of questions are have been asked a lot for echo-state networks. At least I've seen, I know lots of papers. There is a significant amount of research involving recurrent neural networks that are trained, so random recurrent neural networks, which are trained like echo-state networks. I do not know, let's put it this way, many works involving recurrent neural networks trained with backpropagation that try to answer this kind of questions or try to address this kind of problems. It's probably because I don't know the literature, but I will introduce some of the, let's say, a specific concept that has been exploited a lot in the field of echo-state networks in terms of behavior or reliability of behavior of a recurrent neural network. And that's the concept of echo-state property. Right. So what's the echo-state property? The echo-state property is a property of an echo-state network, which, in my opinion, should be a property of all recurrent neural networks, but in the literature, this has been studied in the field of echo-state network. And the property is basically saying that a network has the echo-state property if given an input, forcing the dynamics, the network is producing a unique response, attractive response. And a unique response, it means that the sequence of states, or considering deterministic outputs, the sequence of outputs is basically the same thing, but it's interesting to talk about the sequence of states. The sequence of state is unique, basically. So there is a unique response of the network given an input, regardless of the specific parameterization that we use for the model. All right. So, and all right, I think this probably explains better what I'm talking about. This little small diagram that you see here, right? So, regardless of the initial condition, of the network. There are three initial conditions that you see here. If we consider the same input forcing the dynamics, then basically the echo state property, if the network has the echo state property, after a short transient, the sequence of state will converge to a unique sequence of state that we can call attracting trajectory. All right. And this trajectory is unique, meaning that regardless of the initial condition, there is one attracting trajectory, okay, for a specific input. Now, if this happens, the network has the echo state property. Now, the echo state property is clearly, in my opinion, is clearly a property of reliability, right? I think this wants to tell us something about reliable behavior of the network given an input, right? The network is doing always the same thing for that input, and that's a form of reliability, in my opinion. So this has been studied a lot in the field of echo state network. And the main problem is that in initial papers, and lots of important papers have tried to give sufficient conditions for the occurrence of the echo state property for all inputs, so regardless of the specific inputs forcing the dynamics. But these networks are driven by specific inputs. So I think the users are interested in understanding whether the network has echo state property for a specific input, right? So only recently we have seen papers, again by Manjunat, describing giving conditions for the occurrence of the echo state property in echo state networks, but really recurrent neural networks driven by specific inputs. The key problem is that these conditions do not allow us to come up with a useful algorithm, let's put it this way, to understand whether there is echo state property or not in practice, I mean. So it's still very difficult to come up with a practical methodology that can be useful in practice to detect the presence of echo state property, even if we understand very well what it is. Okay, so what we have done in this direction is, before I tell you what we have done, I just wanted to open parentheses, 2 seconds. There is parallel work going on, parallel to echo state property, which is along the line, going along the line of synchronization. So recent synchronization is something well known in the field of complex systems. But recently people started to look at synchronization in recurrent neural networks, in particular in random recurrent neural networks, because people want to get rid of training because it's already messy. So let's focus first on random recurrent neural networks, echo state networks in particular. And people started to draw parallels between echo state property and synchronization, in particular generalized synchronization. So I'm not going to say anything about this. This is just a pointer for you if you're interested. There are things going on in this direction, linking generalized synchronization, all forms of synchronization and the echo state property. So generalized synchronization and recurrent neural networks, if you want. We have published something along these directions with Cesare and Pietro, very bright student that graduated a few months ago. And I close the parentheses about. Let's go back to the echo state property idea, the unique attracting response. What we have done with Peter and Andrea is to generalize this idea of a unique attracting trajectory. And basically we have said that, yes, it's an interesting idea that the network will behave in a reliable way, right? It's going to do one thing, but maybe it can do one thing locally in state space, meaning that if we start on a neighborhood, on a specific subset of the state space, yes, the network will have the echo state property in that subset of the state space. But we are not ignoring the possibility that there might be multiple responses, multiple behaviors going on in the network in different areas, in different regions of the state space. So basically what we have done is to come up with a local definition of the echo state property, right? So, and basically we have defined what you might call non-autonomous multi-stability of a recurrent neural network. Basically a neural network, a recurrent neural network, which, given an input, might respond in multiple ways, which are stable responses. So the behavior is fine, is controlled, but multiple responses, not just one. All right, and that's a possibility. Why not? Right. So we have worked along these lines, and we have published the paper here. So, and this is the diagram, basically, which describes what I said. With one input, the network might respond in different ways depending on the initial conditions, basically. Okay. Now, so if the network responds in 3 different ways, then we say that the echo index is 3 of the network. That's basically, this is counting the number of possible attractive responses or possible, let's say, possible responses of the network given an input. All right. Let's say I'll try to give you some justification of why this is reasonable, in my opinion. For sure, it's not unreasonable, at least in my opinion. So if you think about classification of time series, we process one time series, and then we make a decision at the end, right? So for instance, let's look at this very simple setting here. This will be the hyperplane in state space, which is useful. We use for making a decision, class 1, class -1. Okay. When we process time series with a recurrent neural network, we update the states, and typically at the end we do something, aggregate the information, and make a decision. So we follow a trajectory in state space, then we make a decision depending on where we are. Like we see that we are on this side of the hyperplane, so it's +1. Echo state property is telling us that if we start here with the same time series, we always end up following the same attracting trajectory after a short transient. So we will make the same decision. So we will output the same class. That's echo state property, classic echo state property. What we are saying is that, yes, this is nice, of course, but it's equivalently okay if the network is following different trajectories, right? So the network with a different initial condition, same input, is ends up in different state space region, as long as you are on the right side of the hyperplane. Who cares? That's fine, right? So if you end up on the right side of the hyperplane, still okay for classification, right? At least in terms of classification. Now, you might say that in this type of behavior might be problematic in forecasting or other type of task. Yes, that's true. But I will say that there are computations which actually require this form of multi-stability. For instance, in the paper, now I'm not showing you here the specific task we are considered in this paper here, because it's it's going to take 10 minutes just to understand, just to describe what the task is about. But there are specific type of computation which are called context dependent. So it really the output depends on where we start, basically. So it depends on the context. And in those cases, a network probably do not, you don't want to have the, you don't necessarily want to have the echo state property, one input, one response. You might want to learn a more general version of the echo state property, like this one, like generalized echo state property that we have defined in this paper. Okay, so I'm not sure whether I was very convincing, but at least I don't think it's very unrealistic. You know, the hypothesis that this is happening, and this is probably also okay. I think the main question is what's really going on when we train a recurrent neural network, right? So I think that's also that's actually one of my future research direction. In the if we use let's say common well-known state-of-the-art recurrent neural networks, and we use those networks on tasks that we all know for benchmarks, what happens? Are we automatically, you know, enforcing the echo state property and we don't know, or we almost always end up with cases with behaviors like this? So we have multiple outputs given the same inputs. I think these are interesting questions, and we should investigate what happens with the actual network that we use these days on the common task that we use for benchmark, for instance. But I see that I have like 1 minute, so I'm going to skip the technical details of behind the generalization of the echo state property. We needed to rely on the theory of non-autonomous dynamical systems, because we were modeling these attracting trajectories that I mentioned, right? And these attracting trajectories are attractors in the non-autonomous settings. And so I'll skip these details because otherwise it's just too confusing. What is, I think it's probably interesting for you, is this, I think this is very intuitive. For instance, a recurrent neural network with echo index 2, so with the same input, can behave in two different ways. Basically, this means that the network can follow two different attracting trajectories, which are non-autonomous attractors that we have called uniform or local point attractors. And this is basically what's going on in a network that has echo index 2. Basically, depending on the initial condition, you might follow this attractor here or this attractor here. Now, these attractors that you see here are lines, right? Because they are trajectories in state space, because the system, the network here is driven by input. So we don't see fixed points when there are inputs. We don't see actual periodic orbits. We see something more complicated. And the uniform or local point attractors that we have defined are actually fixed points in the non-autonomous setting. And as you can see here, fixed points in the non-autonomous setting is already very complex, right? Because it's, you know, it's a trajectory, so it can be very complicated. All right, so I hope the main idea of our contribution is fairly clear. Basically, is this decomposition in attracting trajectories, local point attractors, if you want. And that's good. All right. So I'm going to skip this. We managed to obtain some theoretical results, which I will say they are okay, but they are not very interesting because we came up with sufficient condition for the existence of the local point attractors, which are, you know, they are sufficient. So we don't know if they are not necessary. So maybe there is work to be done there. For sure, there is. I would like to conclude with two research lines, which I'm working on right now, let's say these days, and I think they are a bit of a mix of what I discussed today. So the first one is really interesting, and I guess it's, I would really like to understand what's going on with the gates in terms of vanishing and exploding gradient. And And I know, we know actually, that the gates are modulating the time scale of the network in some way. It will be very nice to understand how this reflects to the training, to the behavior of the training algorithm, and how the behavior of the training algorithm is, interacting with the dynamics of the network in state space, because these two things are connected. Training and dynamics of the network are two. You can imagine these two things as two systems which are interacting, and I guess the gates are an important player, because apparently they are mitigating the problem, but it would be nice to understand exactly how. Now, another interesting question is, there is lots of research about obtaining smart parametrization of recurrent neural network, a more stable version of gradient descent, backpropagation through time, that avoid the vanishing and exploding gradient problem. But even if we obtain stable training mechanism for recurrent neural networks, are we sure that we obtain something that is reliable in state space, like behaviors of the echo state property type, right? So even if we train a network and the network works, are we sure that we get the echo state property, or we don't care, or we never get the echo state property when we train the network with backpropagation? So it would be nice to link the reliability of training with the reliability, some notion of reliability of behavior in state space. That's the point, I guess. Okay, these are the acknowledgements as sponsor, and thank you very much for your time.
Okay, thank you for the interesting talk. I guess we will open to questions. So any questions from the audience? Okay, if not, I have a questions. So you mentioned that different initial conditions can lead to different response, right? So I was wondering, also there's this equal state property. And so I was wondering how would the initializations of the parameters in the network affect this behavior. So let's say you initialize the network on the edge of chaos, then how will it so does the resulting network still has this equal state property, or do we expect different type of behavior at the edge of chaos?
So I guess that's the interesting question. So the echo state property is a property of a specific parameterization of the model, right? You parameterize the model, given an input, you want to see whether the network has the echo state property, right? So you said on the edge of chaos, can we still obtain the echo state property? I guess that's a tricky question, right? Because the tricky part is what is the edge of chaos, right? So as I say, there is a significant amount of papers published along that direction, but the definition of the edge of chaos with an input forcing the dynamics is not convincing, at least to the mathematicians that are doing those kind of things.
Even if the input is just like constant.
Sorry?
If the input is just a constant instead of time varying, if it's just a constant.
Okay. Well, in that case, it doesn't create a problem, because then if the input is constant, the network is autonomous, and then it's very easy to come up with the definition of the edge of chaos. We know how to do it. And the echo state property, it's also probably obvious definition, right?
Yeah,
so in that case, it wouldn't create problems. But in all other cases, I will say that yes, we probably will have problems at a conceptual level, I would say. We can still use the methods that are out there for, doing hyperparameter search and identify the edge of chaos. And then there are also heuristics to check the echo-state property. There are these things. We can still do it, but we will have the problems that I mentioned for sure.
I see. So even if like, okay, let's say consider like the case where the input is like a white noise, like just in discrete time is just IID Gaussians. So you say that there are no theory for even for this case?
No, to my knowledge, yes, in that case, yes, there is. I think I mentioned one paper. Yes, this one. I think that's the case. Additive Gaussian noise. So basically, the transition is observed when the spectral radius of the recurrent connection is larger than 1 plus the, I don't remember now exactly what is f. That's probably the standard deviation of the noise, but I don't remember exactly what they define as f of the noise. So it's a function of the noise, and this setting is well studied, I guess.
I see. Yeah, I think the question is whether f is positive, right, or not. Yeah. Okay.
I don't know.
So,
we should check the paper. I don't remember.
Yeah, I will also look this paper out. Yeah, because it would be really nice to. Yeah, even if we have some theory for this case, white noise. Wait, this is additive noise. So does it mean that it's not necessarily Gaussian also works?
Perhaps. And I don't remember the details of the paper, but maybe it's probably general, the prediction.
Okay, I see. Interesting.
Yeah, and there are some recent results here in reference 24, which account for a more general setting and do not make assumption about the nature of the input. But I think it's still not very useful in practice in terms of algorithm, to come up with a method to detect the methodology. But it's definitely a very interesting research direction, this one by Manjunath.
Can you send me this paper, because I cannot find it online, because I only have the name, so not the title of the paper.
Sure, I can actually show you the references, or I can send you. I can send you later. Maybe I'll write in the chat. Just a second.
'26, right?
24.
Oh, 24, 26.
26 is the one with additive noise. 24 is the one, the recent one, addressing the problem with any type of input, but in a different setting. So 26 is the one with additive noise.
I see. Nice. Yeah, okay. So are there any questions from the audience? Okay, if not, so yeah, thank you, Lorenzo, for the interesting talk. And yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yep. See you.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you. All right. So thanks for having me here. So let's keep in touch, and let me know if you want some of these references. I can definitely share the references with you if you're interested.
Yeah, I think all the references are here, and I mean this is recorded, so I can easily find it, I guess.
Okay.
But yeah, but in case if I need any, if I want to know more things, then maybe I will contact you again.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, okay. Thank you for talking. See you.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Take care.
Bye-bye.